You're listening to the Archaeology Podcast Network.
Welcome to episode 133 of a Life in Ruins podcast, where we investigate the careers of those living life in ruins. I'm your host, Carlton, and today I am joined by my co-host, Connor Johnnon. David is unable to join us because he's currently out taking out two birds with one stick. For this week's episode, we are joined by Josh Wolford. Josh, thank you so much for being on the show. How are you doing today, man?
I'm doing great. Staying warm here in a very snowy West Michigan.
I heard Michigan got a lot of snow. So we got introduced to Josh half a year ago at this point. So we've been emailing back and forth trying to get him on the show for quite some time. We were really intrigued by his current research as well as his master's thesis. So that's what he's on to talk about today. So once again, man, thank you so much for being so understanding with our ridiculous summer schedule and then us getting back on track so we can get you out for December. So welcome to the show, man.
No worries, man. Yeah, I understand how busy it is, and you guys are all doing archaeology this summer. It's not like you can bring this out to the field, I imagine.
We've tried. Yeah. This is the most diplomatic way to put that. We've tried.
That's where David was all this summer. It's like trying to get him via Starlink to do this was a wild ride.
Yes. Yeah, I can imagine. Yeah, because they were out in the middle of nowhere, Wyoming, weren't they?
Yes. Or he was trying to siphon the free Wi-Fi off of a library from the parking lot. It was,
it was wild.
we tried. He put his heart into it. We were like, David, we'll just record without you, man. This is too much.
Yeah.
But anyways, about you, not about David.
It's all good.
Can you just, for our audience, introduce yourself, who you are, where are you at academically, and what you're doing, man?
My name is Josh Wolford. I have a master's degree in anthropology from Wayne State University in Detroit, Michigan, or should I say Detroit, Michigan. I got my bachelor's at Western Michigan University in Kalamazoo, and actually I double minored in biology and geology, hence why my thesis is quite interdisciplinary. I've pretty much been interested in not just archaeology, but all that stuff since I was like a little kid. I grew up on Lake Huron. There was rocks, everywhere from every time period in geologic history. And, I remember growing up watching, I think it was Jurassic Park was what it did for me. They were like hitting rocks with hammers, and there's fossils of dinosaurs. And I'm like, whoa, I want to do that. So I was like 2, 3 hitting rocks on the beach, but I would be disappointed because I would find like coral and not a dinosaur. So I was like, that's not cool. But when I got older, I realized that, hey, that is super cool because this is coral. And this is not tropical where I live now. Michigan is not tropical, but it was. And that kind of like threw me down this whole rabbit hole of loving geology and everything.
I think, that's the thing. We always find like shells, fossilized shells as a kid. And you're like, well, this is boring. And then you like realize like, I found fossilized shells in the Appalachian Mountains in West Virginia where there is not an ocean. Like, wait a moment. That was cool as hell.
Yeah. And then you realize how old they are. Like that coral, like the Petoskey stone, which actually, this isn't a Petoskey. This is a Rugose coral. It's 400 million years old.
That's on your desk.
Yes. Well, I have a lot more on my desk. But I have, as I told you, I have lots of rocks.
I love our field so much. I love it.
I got a little shell. I got a little ammonite.
It looks like an ammonite.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's what happens when you're an archaeologist nerd, something like that.
I have nothing nearly that old on my desk at all. I have a lot. Yeah. Damn it. I need to go get shells.
Yeah. I mean, like that's just thinking about her finding geology so fascinating, like talking about finding shells in the Appalachian Mountains. Or like even like Mount Everest is a great example where literally at the summit, there's limestone that's, I think, 30 million years old and it has shell fossils, 29,000 feet above sea level.
That's wild.
Yeah.
There's also a bunch of dead bodies.
There are. They're frozen. They're still there. They can't get them off.
That boggles my mind. Okay, sorry. As a detour, so you obviously you mentioned that you're interested in the hard sciences. Where does like the anthropology come into that?
That came in because I'm also super interested in like history and mythology. I just love studying all sorts of different mythologies. I find myself like hyper focusing into like Norse mythology for some time and Greek mythology for some time and so on. And then I've always been into like studying different mythologies, just learning about each one. Like first, like maybe Norse mythology, Greek mythology, and so on. And then I was like, I wonder what are the stories of like where I live in the Great Lakes? Do we have like, gods and all these epic stories like the Odyssey and stuff like that? We do. And that's what kind of like made me dive into studying Anishinaabe culture. And just because that's where I live is in the Great Lakes. And we have, to quote James Red Sky, who is an elder from Kenora, Ontario, which is like up near the border of Minnesota, Lake of the Woods region. He was interviewed by Solomon Dubney for his book, Sacred Scrolls of the Southern Ojibwe. He basically said, he pointed on the shelf of the Bible, and he said, you see that Bible? There's that much and much more in medieval. And that to me is just like, whoa, there's all this like knowledge that's just not written down. It's in like their ancestral memory. And they did recount these things, birch bark scrolls and rock art, but that's like shorthand. It's like pre-hieroglyphics kind of deal. It's like where one image will represent a whole story, which is so cool, man.
Yeah, man. No, that's really cool. And I also like picked up on how you referred to it as we have those histories with that recognition of like tying yourself to the land in a way of like recognizing like you're not othering yourself. I thought that was I caught on to that. Really appreciate that.
Well, I mean, I have a tiny little bit of Anishinaabe because I have on my dad's mom's side, her side of the family is French Canadian. And so it was very common in fact, it was encouraged in the colonial period for the voyageurs to intermarry with Native women because by marrying into that clan, they would have access to that hunting territory and having access to all the furs. And if, I'm sure you guys know that the fur trade during like the colonial period is pretty much what built America, essentially.
Yes, it did.
Yeah.
Yes. Just yes.
Yeah.
Solid, man. So where'd you go to undergrad, I guess? So you're at Wayne State now.
I graduated from Wayne
so
State.
You're done from Wayne. That's where you did your thesis.
Yeah, I thought about getting my PhD. I almost decided to get it. And then I listened to one of your guys' episodes. I can't remember who you had on. She had like a dual PhD.
Oh, Lana.
Yeah, it's like in psychology and she was like something about left-handedness.
Yeah, paleo. Yeah.
That was great. But she was talking about how hard it was for her to find a job with 2 PhDs. I'm like, wow, her resume is way better than mine. Maybe I shouldn't go for this. So I kind of decided against it. But my undergrad, I originally started going to a place called Saginaw Valley because I was pre-med at first. And I was just kind of studying anthropology, archaeology for fun. Like between class and homework, I would go up into the 4th floor of the library there and just pick out different books about Ojibwe peoples and Anishinaabe peoples and read about them. And then I think it was after I took Gen Chem chemistry, I was like, wow, this is fucking hard. I'm going to have to do, Chem 2, Orgo 1 and 2, Physics 1 and 2, Calc 1 and 2. I'm like, I'm not that good at math. So maybe I should stop trying to be a doctor and follow this archaeology thing.
Well, it's weird because I think like initially in a lot of cases, you want to get into something that you can see a career in. And I don't think we as a discipline advertise archaeology or anthropology as something that you can get a career in that's going to make you money. I mean, it's not going to make you a ton of money. It's not going to make you med money, but it will.
Certainly not.
Yeah, but there are places for folks in anthropology.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
And archaeology. So I feel like that's a very common thing that we see is that people are like, I'm going to go for like a real job and then I'll study this like on the side. But you can like pursue this as a career.
Oh yeah, definitely. And like, there's so many different avenues that you could take anthro. Like I was a tour guide on Mackinac Island for 5 seasons. And I really looked at that as like kind of like my field work. And I looked at that, even though I worked 70 hours a week giving tours to people, I kind of was enveloped in this place that was like, it's sacred. Like that's Mackinac Island is the spot, I'm going to talk about in my paper, where the spot of recreation of the world after the destruction of the flood. And the Anishinaabe up there still believe that. Yeah,
those flood stories are pretty ubiquitous across North America. Yeah. Everyone has one, which is always fascinating, just as an aside. But
yeah, it's usually a crazy arc, arc in the story.
It's almost like there was like this time period where there was a lot more ice and then it started to melt.
Yeah, right. Which that would be like all this fresh water all of a sudden. And back when the rivers were not as deep, they were all, fairly shallow and wide and very susceptible to flooding these large landscapes if they got oversaturated. Who would have guessed, right?
Well, yeah, and that's the interesting thing is that, I've read so many different sources from so many different, whether it was historic literature or an ethnologist or an anthropologist, or it was a native themselves that wrote it, talking about the flood, different versions of what characters were, it's kind of like fill in the Mad Lib of who was the one that inspired the muskrat to swim down to the bottom and grab the piece of soil to create the land. It could be Nanaboja, it could be Nokomis, could be the animals themselves, could have been Gishimanitou, could have been all sorts of different people or Manitous. But there was one story from James Red Sky, who I mentioned a little earlier, who I've never found this anywhere else, where he mentioned that the creator tried to create the world 4 times. The first 3 times he failed because there's too much water and there's too much ice. And each time it took to recreate was between 2,000 and 4,000 years. It's like, well, that's exactly like the length of time that these proglacial lake periods were around, where there was a lot of ice. They couldn't go further north, because the ice was there, and then all that water and seasonal flooding.
That's fascinating.
Yeah. I thought when I read that, like, whoa, no way. It like literally fits right into my, because I found that when I was doing some heavy research into my thesis, because I kind of developed this idea giving tours, because there was Mackinac Island is, as it says in the story, it is on the back of a great turtle. It rose out of the water. But for geologists, that island is one of the best places you can go in the Great Lakes to see paleo shorelines. There's over 25 on the island, all over it. And there was one spot where I would stop with my buggy and my passengers, and it's called Rifle Range. And in my Geology of Michigan book, they specifically mentioned Rifle Range as a great place to see ancient shorelines. And you can see 11 that roll down a hill from what road is it? Carriage Road down to Fort Mackinac. A lot of people usually tell the story about the attack at Fort Mackinac from the British there, but then I started to talk about, well, actually look at these ancient shorelines. And I would talk about isostatic rebound, which is it's like the crust of the earth is solid, obviously, because we're all on top of all our buildings and we drive around on it and everything. But in the mass scale, it behaves more like a plastic. And when you put something really heavy on top of it, it'll sink, kind of like in the foam of a mattress or the chairs we're sitting in right now. It's depressed under the weight of our butts. But then when we stand, the foam will return to its original shape. And that tendency for returning to its original shape is called itostasy. And so the itostasy and the active rebounding is called isostatic rebound. And that happened, it's still happening to this day in Michigan, very, very, like almost unmeasurable. But up in Hudson Bay, it still is rebounding, I think something like 1 or 2 inches a year.
That's wild, especially, and that's like based on like from the glaciers, right? Because you have like, like I don't remember how high the glaciers are, but that's like a big chunk of ice that you're just like sitting on top of this.
Oh yeah,
like insane amount.
Michigan, like I'll use my hand. I don't know if you've ever seen anyone do this. The ice was basically this from here to here was what they call something the hinge line, which is where there was the most, or where they're actually rather able to measure isostatic rebound in the crust of like the lower peninsula. And over that point is about a mile and a half thick. Up near Hudson Bay, it was like 2 miles thick. Just immense. The place just seems 2 million years long almost. It was like 2.1 million years ago, I think, is when it technically started. And that's exhibited through ice cores where we can see 800,000 years back. But, the peaking and troughing of CO2 concentrations, and it's in those interglacial periods, or rather the troughs of CO2, that's a glacial period. And then when we get a peak, there's higher amounts of CO2 in the atmosphere. So that indicates it was warmer because it's a greenhouse gas, climate change, all that sort of thing.
It'd be wild for you just for a human to walk up and be like, oh, there's this big old pile, like a mile high pile of ice. Like, I guess I shouldn't keep going on.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I think though with the continental glaciers, it would just be like a gradual thing. And you wouldn't even realize if you're walking on top of it, that you would probably be like a mile above the actual rock, because that just would be the ground, basically. But there was probably lots of fissures and crevasses in there that, you could fall into. In a book, Talking Rocks, Carl Godboy, Earth Walks is what his native name is. He said they called it the old man, is what they called the ice. And in one of their stories, it's like the dueling of two shamans, where there's the old man winter, and then there's the youthful spring. And they would battle every year, and the spring would win every year, obviously. And that he thinks that was a metaphor for the ultimate, I guess, victory of spring taking over the land, because there's no more ice, really, like there once was.
Huh. Dude, that's fascinating. And on that note, we're going to go ahead and close out this segment. We'll be right back with episode 133 of Life in Ruins here with Josh Wolford.
Welcome back to episode 133 of Life in Ruins podcast. We're here with Josh Wolford, and we just gotta dive straight into it. You have an interesting story about something you found in a privy.
Oh,
could you tell us about what your field school was and what this interesting artifact was?
So in my field school for Western Michigan University, we did 2 different sites. The first site was on this island in an inland lake in southeast Michigan called Apple Island, where we weren't really looking for Native American stuff. We were doing more of we were actually working under a grant to try to get the island put under the National Historic Registry. And we ended up succeeding. We got registered from the work we did there, but we were studying Victorian era vacationing, which vacationing was a new thing at this time period. But then, so that we were there for 4 weeks. And then for the next 4 weeks, we went up to the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, camped on Lake Superior and Munising for all that time. And every day we drove out to the Hiawatha National Forest to this place called Colwood. And Colwood was a cordwood lumber town that was predominantly populated by Finnish people. And there was one non-Finn, and he was the headmaster, and he lived in the nice house, and all the other the Finns lived in kind of the not nice houses because they were the workers. The town's no longer there. If you go there now, it's literally just pine plantation, and you can see holes in the ground from privies and from looters. So knowing that site was heavily looted, we ended up just kind of studying looting behavior as well, partially also with Finnish, culture in the Upper Peninsula at a lumber camp. So we'd always joke around that we would think that, these looters are tweakers or something like that, going out to the woods to go dig up bottles, because they dig up the bottles and then they sell them. So I was 5 feet down a privy that had, mottled soil. There was no strata at all. So it indicated looting behavior. And, kept finding things like a boot that was 100 years old and an old sweater, and it was amazing. It was wool. It was, kind of tells you how good wool is. It didn't even degrade after 100 years. And, a pile of what a privy is. But beneath all that stuff, at the very bottom, I found it just looked like a pipe stem sticking out of the soil, but it was glass. It wasn't white ball, clay, which we found tons of on Apple Island, because that was late 1800s, which is very common to find those sorts of pipes. This was clear glass, and it looked manufactured, not blown. And so I was like, oh, that's a crack pipe. And then I, dig out around it, got it all perfect, and I ended up on one of the graduate students' posters for looting behavior, and was the crack pipe. And I remember actually talking about that when someone was asking me, what was one of your favorite things you found at Coldwood? I mean, there was axe blades and old saw blades all over the place. That's really cool. Found old medicine bottles with Finnish written on it. Old medicine bottles that were literally only on the market for 1 year, like for children's cough syrup, that had both morphine and alcohol and I can't remember what else in it. So obviously that didn't stay on the market for very long. But I said, the crack pipe, just because it's indicative of all the behavior of the people that, looted that place.
That's fascinating.
Wild.
Anthropology.
The anthropology of looting is an interesting one. Fueled by much crack, maybe some meth in there as well.
Oh, probably. It keeps them going.
Well, not the archaeologists, but the looters, 100%.
Yeah. Caffeine keeps us going.
Caffeine and usually alcohol is what fuels an archaeologist.
Oh, and it's not just archaeologists. I'll tell you that, pretty much every field school does that. I know I've heard the geology field school, they party a lot.
Oh,
I've heard the same thing. I think geologists might be on par with the archaeologists.
Yeah, they're cool.
But not the biologists. I've heard the biologists.
They don't party as much. No. Yeah. I was thinking about that the other day. They're a little bit more studious.
They care about birds and plants and
shit. I mean, I do too, but I
just joking.
It's just insult a whole discipline.
We love you.
Yeah. Well, I minored in biology, so I absolutely love it. But yeah, they don't like the party like the geologists or the archaeologists do.
Fair. Well, we wanted to start off this segment with that because Josh was telling us this story in the green room in between segments, and you need to tell our audience about the crack pipe you found. That's how we're going to kick this off. But on to something more serious. We really wanted to talk about Josh's thesis and how it's not only interdisciplinary, but also is in my experience, rarity to see someone incorporate who's not from an Indigenous background, Indigenous perspectives into the work to give a more holistic understanding of the research questions and research outcomes. And I really, really like your introduction. It reads very much like James Dietz and how he would any article or book he would do. He would set a narrative. And if it's okay, can I read your first paragraph? Because it's fantastic. Okay. Out tucked away in the far reaches of the northern edge of the earth lies a vast wilderness of forest and plains, tundra and rock, lakes and rivers, much of which has remained seemingly unchanged since the last vestiges of the retreat of Ice Age glaciers. This land has not always appeared this way. It was locked under the forceful grip of an ancient ice sheet that spread across North America, an ice sheet that scoured, plucked, and pruned the land and left it never looking the same. But this cold wilderness was not devoid of life, language, and culture, just as its modern counterpart isn't devoid of these things today. The ancestors of the indigenous peoples who live in the boreal forests of this northern land today were witness to the changing of this land. They lived through the cataclysmic changes to which it wrought, and they lived to tell the story. And tell their story they did. For thousands of years, the succeeding generations of northern peoples have hunted, gathered, fished, danced, and loved in the land their ancestors did the same on. They witnessed events that geologists and archaeologists long to know and who spend their livelihoods trying to know about. Since the meeting of their two worlds, the scientists and the natives have had a clash of their worldviews. Yet there are numerous facets of reality that they could learn from each other and corroborate each other's narrative. That was really well done.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Also,
I try to not make it boring. Science can be really boring, but also it's so fascinating. I just wanted to, try to make it a little bit more. One of my professors said that it was evocative, and that's what I try to go for, I guess. is that I read, like, Farley Mullet is probably one of my favorite authors. He's kind of a famous Canadian author, and his most famous book is like Never Cry Wolf. But my book that I really like from him is called People of the Deer. And that's a lot of inspiration came from that book, for sure. Highly recommend.
Yeah, no, that was great. I'd say it was evocative. Connor?
Yeah, no, I was gonna say it's great, and also thank you for letting us read it, because if
absolutely.
you read my opening paragraph, I might have PTSD. And
I was worried about sending mine. I was like, oh well, there's pieces I need to fix. I want to add stuff to it, take things away, because I reread it now for the 100th time, and I'm like, oh geez, I could do so much better than this in this part of the paper. But I'm always going to be picking myself apart. I'm really
I can't look at my thesis anymore. But
the best thesis is a done thesis.
It is.
So what was the goal of this thesis? Like, you're obviously studying the intersection of a bunch of different things.
Mm-hmm.
Like, what was the kind of goal going into your writing of this?
I guess it was me just, kind of developing this idea over 5 years of, driving my carriage tours. That's kind of where all this started. And how I just thought it was amazing how both the geology and the Native American oral tradition, the Anishinaabe oral tradition, basically corroborated each other. And how, because I would maybe sometimes, not as much as I would, you would think, but I would deal with like somebody on my carriage tour, on a public carriage tour, would be like, isn't the earth like 6,000 years old or something? And that happened. Not as often, but this kind of just like helps corroborate, like, no, there was people here that witnessed the water and the ice of the Pleistocene, and the formation of the subsequent Great Lakes that came afterwards. But then also the narrative that is behind modern geologic theory corroborates what the Anishinaabe people tell us that they saw, that their ancestors saw, which is just so fascinating to me. And the book, there's one book that actually, I sent to you guys as one of my recommended, it's called Talking Rocks. And it's authored by a Minnesota State geologist and an Ojibwe elder from, I think he taught at University of Minnesota Duluth for some time. But they basically it's a conversation is what the book is kind of about. It's not very academic. It'd be great for like undergraduate, intro students for anthro, or maybe like learning about like Native Americans. But it shows like the interdisciplinary work of how geology or like hard science rather, and Indigenous philosophy are, compatible. Because like studying ecology, the whole science of ecology, the field of ecology started from Indigenous people all over the world. Because like at first, ecology wasn't considered a science because, people would say, there's no way all this stuff is interconnected. All these, a little like bug or a little like shrimp, freshwater shrimp that lives in the river, that can affect, the eagles or something like that. But then you realize that, it's all interconnected. That's kind of why I wanted to take, geology and biology to help me understand better, the people of that time period.
One thing that I did notice, and like this is not a citation list that I'm necessarily familiar with, but how difficult was it to come across Indigenous authors on the subject rather than like anthropology or ethnographers who were just kind of repeating stories that they heard? Because like you have a lot of Indigenous narratives and Indigenous oral history present throughout your thesis, and how they really corroborated with the geology and the archaeology really nicely, as you would expect people who are descendants of those who lived through these things. Like, what was that like, trying to find Indigenous voices or promote the Indigenous speakers themselves?
Well, some of my sources I got, because what kind of got me into one thing that got me into anthropology was Michael John, who passed away, when I was kind of young, and he was just really interested in like geology and studying archaeology for his own, fancy, and he just really liked it. And he started finding stone mounds in southeastern Michigan that he, some of them were from farmers, but he associated some others with like caribou hunting structures. And so he kind of dove in and bought all sorts of books, about Anishinaabe culture and geology and all sorts of things like that. He passed away, and my cousin ended up giving me a lot of his books. And many of them were like from Basil Johnston, Ojibwe Heritage, the Manitous, which is the spiritual world of the Ojibwe. So I kind of had this nice, I guess, launching pad for me with sources, was from like this 2 boxes of books that I got from my uncle. And that kind of like, I read through all of those, and then I just started, that kind of showed me the right questions to ask, or maybe the certain things just to look up on Amazon. I would just always Google like different books on Amazon to read. And then I would just find myself digging through old books in the library. So it kind of was like, this research is like, I guess like 10 years in the making. So I kind of started doing this stuff like when I was a senior in high school. And so it's taken a long time to kind of find all these different sources. It kind of comes from like, also my dad, he likes to study theology, but he always talks about using a hermeneutic approach. And so I always really liked that. So I was trying to read from the perspective of, Anishinaabe first, and then not from what some anthropologists said, but what did the Anishinaabe say,
Did you ever find any discrepancies or like differences in how the anthropologists interpreted or wrote down these kind of origin stories? Was there ever any like big differences between kind of the primary literature, the primary source, versus kind of the later anthropologists kind of?
Sort of. I know that like in the book Sacred Scrolls of the Southern Ojibwe by Selwyn Dewdney, I think it was 1976 that he wrote that. That's where he's investigating. So they would, I don't think they still do. So I said they would inscribe different stories on birch bark, and they would hide them away in caves or what have you. The Medewawin scrolls is what they were. And Medewawin is the Grand Medicine Society in Anishinaabe culture. And so one of the primary objectives of Medewawin is to keep creation stories and the history of the culture. But Selwyn Dewdney was trying to accomplish with that research was, follow their migration, because there's migration scrolls. The Anishinaabe say they originated on the coast, on the Atlantic Ocean, and then they migrated to where they live now, to the land of wild rice at southern Lake Superior, basically, and all the way up into like, the Saulteaux peoples are up in like Lake Winnipeg, which are kind of like what could be considered Oji-Cree, which is like a mixture of Ojibwe and Cree cultures. But he kind of didn't believe that Medewawin was pre-contact. There was some anthropologists for some time, there might be still some today, that believe that Medewawin was not pre-contact. It was a result of maybe social movements within Anishinaabe culture themselves to resist, Europeanization or Christianization of their culture. And it was them trying to like kind of resist that. But there's evidence that, of birch bark scrolls found in caves that are, predate contact period. And there's rock art that could be associated with Medewawin traditions that are, there's one in Michigan. It's in the Upper Peninsula. They call it the Spider-Man. It's not really a Spider-Man, but that's just what it's called. That's like 1,500 years old. So that right there kind of fits pre-contact. So that's like really the only discrepancy, I guess, I'm finding, that some anthropologists don't necessarily agree. Oh, well, Medewawin pre-contact or post-contact, or, there's definitely influence that you could see, because no culture is isolated from itself. Everyone influences everything,
right.
Ojibwe influenced Pawnee, I'm sure, in some way, and vice versa.
Mm-hmm. What's the reception been of your thesis to descendant communities, if it's been shared with them yet, I guess?
I haven't shared the thesis with them per se, but I've given tours to plenty. Actually, I was like a blessing. I picked up, it was a private tour I had where I picked up in the early morning one of our bigger private carriages. And it was a class from Bay Mills Reservation, which is on like an hour from the island. And it was their folklore class. And I had like 3 elders on there that their first language was Ojibwe. I had students, they're all Ojibwe, and they told me a lot of stories, and I shared with them what my thesis was. And they go, that's fascinating. They loved it. Another time that I remember I gave a tour. I used to tell the flood story. I used to tell that on my tour. And when we stopped at the Arch Rock is where people would get off and, go take a picture of a big rock. Two people came up to me and they said, did you know you have a descendant of Chief Shingwakons in your parish? Chief Shingwakons was a famous Ojibwe chief who fought in the War of 1812. And he was like one of the ones that stole the fort from the Americans. And I've read lots about him. And I'm just, oh my gosh, no way. They were like super thankful. They go, thank you for telling our stories. That's what they told me. And I'm like, that means so much to me.
No, that's really cool. And I think, something that in terms of larger conversations that we've had with like in the Society for American Archaeology and how to do collaborative community-based archaeology and Indigenous archaeology, like doing a truly collaborative thesis is like really hard to do because of the short window.
Yeah.
But in terms of, reading your thesis and how you've done it, I think it's done respectfully. Mm-hmm. That's how it comes across to me in terms of like highlighting, like, this is what the Indigenous folks say. And I've never really, one of the things that archaeologists struggle with in terms of, the old guard and not believing that oral traditions are legit and how the archaeological record in and of itself is based on interpretation bias. But like kind of your approach with like, these are geologic events that like are not disputed.
This is hard science.
This is hard science. And these are these stories that talk about these known geologic events in pre-contact is like, oh, that's geology is where we should be going to cite like, oral traditions are legit because we can, that's what I picked out of this. Like, oh, wait a moment.
Yeah. I mean, there's examples all over the world too, other than just mine. I think Nature published something, which is like the journal to get into, I think is Australia, where these Aboriginal stories talk about this star that fell and exploded on the earth. And like, yeah, sure. And then like, astronomers are like, actually, we believe like a comet or something hit here like 48,000 years ago.
Right.
And like, people were there too. So they probably are. We should probably listen to them a little bit more.
Yeah, I think, although the journal Nature now has, in terms of whoever's doing their archaeology vetting, Nature's not as prestigious in archaeology anymore. I'm sure other disciplines, it's fine. But
if you're in biology and you get published in Nature, you're doing good stuff.
Yeah, their review process is questionable at best, in archaeology wise.
It's coming across as clickbaity. Like, oh, well,
you guys did an episode all about what those mounds down in Louisiana. Was that a Nature article?
That came out somewhere weird, but I think it was.
Like physicists did it, didn't they? It was like,
yeah. Well, and there was a society for the SAA's archaeological record. They just came out with like a rebuttal. Like the state archaeologist came out and was like, "Yeah, nah, fam."
Yeah, the state archaeologist was not happy with these random people showing up and dating mountains on campus. Like, so we'll wait to see. But yeah, no, this was good. I'd be like intrigued to see what the cultural offices of some of these descendant communities.
Yeah, I applied. So I'm not working in like anthropology at all right now, but when I got out of grad school, I applied to be like a tribal historic preservation officer for a couple different tribes. Got interviewed, but unfortunately didn't get hired. But they liked the research and thought it was cool.
So, all right, we're going to go ahead and end this a little bit longer than usual segment right here. We'll be right back with episode 133 here with Josh Wolford here after these sweet, sweet messages from our amazing producers.
Welcome back to episode 133 of A Life in Ruins podcast. We are with Josh. In this segment, we wanted to dive into the specifics of what you kind of found, your correlation between oral history and geologic events. Do you mind diving in there? Let us know what you kind of correlated through your research.
Yeah, absolutely. So some examples of places and narratives that I have in my research for Shake the Earth was the creation story according to Anishinaabe tradition, which can include a variety of details depending on the context of recounting something that's called Arsokanak, which are sacred living stories or stories of the grandfathers, depending on how you translate that word. It's actually Atasokan is singular and Atasokanak is plural. But Atasokanak is an animate gender of the word for stories that exists in sacred context and are treated as living, non-human persons. The act of telling such sacred living ancestral memories can be elaborated upon or made more concise depending on the situation, and the teller. So it changes a little bit depending on the situation or who's telling the story. But the most ubiquitous version of an Atasokanak that I focused on was the story of creation that involves a creation, destruction, recreation sequence. First, the universe came into existence from the inspiration that a dream the creator had, Geology. And that was before time even began, where they saw everything that is, and they created the universe. And after the creation, there was a destruction through the form of a flood. And in the long form of the story, it was from Nanabojo, who was like the ancestral embodiment of Anishinaabe culture, along with Mayingun, who's the wolf. They went to go kill a Manitou called Mishipeshu, which is the Great Lynx, who controls all the water in not just the Great Lakes, but just, inland lakes, things like that. And Mishipeshu lived in the caves underneath Mackinac Island. So they went there to go kill him, but they only succeeded in cutting off his tail. Hence why lynx have short tail. But they didn't kill him because his body's covered in copper and silver nuggets. So he's also like a patron Manitou of copper from like Isle Royal and places like that. And in his anger, Mishipeshu flooded the earth in retaliation, killing pretty much all life. And it was, after that flood that we have for those who aren't familiar with this creation story, it's been, publicized in like children's books and stuff like that, where there's the great flood. And then it was a great turtle who rose out of the water that offers back for all the animals that survived. And it kind of depends on the story that you look for, but it involves the animals trying to dive down to the bottom of the water to grab a piece of soil to create land on the back of the great turtle. And it's from the turtle's back serving as the nucleus point for where the earth was reborn. And according to Anishinaabe oral traditions, that is Mackinac Island. And the word Mackinac that we have today is just a shortened version of the whole word, which is Miche Mikunakong, which means place of the great turtle. And they refer to the whole region as the place of the great turtle. And because of that notion that land started there or restarted there, and it regrew from there. Because in the oral tradition, they say that the waters receded and the land rose. We talked a little bit about isostatic rebound earlier. And that's where the land literally rose that we can measure. But then also the waters ended up receding away. Because at 11,000 years ago, there was a time period where glacial lake phase was called the Algonquin phase. And the early phase was 230 feet higher than modern lake levels in the Straits of Mackinac region. It would have appeared as a very flooded place compared to today. But then that's because the water was blocked from escaping further north to fill in the Lake Superior Basin and also to drain out into like what is now Georgian Bay. It was blocked by that ice. But then as years went on, the climate started to warm even more. The ice moved further north, opening more avenues for the water to fill in, basins to fill in. But then also the land began to rise. And because of that, two-factor of ice disappearing and land rising, there was an event where the water drained out. It's called the North Channel. It's Georgian Bay. So there's Lake Huron, and then on the north part of Lake Huron, there's Georgian Bay. And it drained across, I think, the Mattawa River and Ottawa River into St. Lawrence, into the ocean. And so it dropped from 230 feet higher than modern lake levels to 150 feet lower than modern lake levels in only a matter of like a few hundred years. And so the people that were there, it's like almost like someone pulled a plug on all that water and it disappeared.
Right.
And so you would have been able to walk from the Lower Peninsula to Mackinac Island at that time. And there was only a mere river that went around the north side of the island. And that river valley was discovered in the 1920s. The article I used to cite that part of my paper was literally written by Dr. Stanley. It's called the Stanley phase of the Glacial Lake Algonquin. And it was actually during that time when Lake Huron was split into 2 lakes, 3 lakes, depending on the source you look at or what time period it is. But there was this isthmus of land that went from Alpena, Michigan to Amberley, Ontario. And there were some archaeologists at University of Michigan in 2009 that were looking at bathymetry maps of Lake Huron and this Alpena Amberley Ridge, or they call it the 100 Fathom Shoal for shippers, for people on like the freighters and stuff. And they were looking on that to find maybe there's some, paleo habitation sites. And they didn't find habitation sites, but they found what they believe is a caribou hunting corral that's 9,000 years old that's at the bottom of Lake Huron. Because at about, I think it was that's the Algonquin stage. Then the Nipissing stage was after the Algonquin, was when the water rose back up. I think it was like, I don't know my Nipissing geology as much as the Algonquin phase. I focused a little bit more on that, but I think it was like 50, 60, 70 feet higher than modern lake levels, maybe more. Sure. Maybe there's someone out there listening to us that knows, the Nipissing shoreline elevation levels, but
I have two comments real quick.
Yes.
Because this is fascinating. It's been really hard for me to find a point to stop you because everything you keep saying is just great. But two things. One, what is it? Royal Island? What was that called?
Isle Royal.
Royal. So there's a student at my department, IU, who's out of Michigan, who works up there. And I recently found out that has the oldest evidence of copper mining and metallurgy in the fucking world. Not just the United States, the world.
Yes.
That place is nuts for mining copper and doing cool stuff out there. So one little fun fact with that. 2, a little bit of a rant. The Turtle Island thing. So Lakotas, I think, are now the largest recognized tribe now by population. They beat out the Dene, but the Anishinaabe, I can never say that word.
Anishinaabe.
Anishinaabe are now 6th largest, but all those groups that come out of the Council of the 7 Fires or 4 Fires, like Potawatomis, there's this whole macro cultural linguistic group that are all related that come out of the Great Lakes are also some of the more larger tribes by population, nations today by population. And so a lot, and they're very active. And this Turtle Island narrative where everyone now oh, so you land back or, totally agree with what I'm saying is this whole, save Turtle Island thing. Or when people ask me specifically about, well, talk about Turtle Island, I'm like, I'm not one of these goddamn people. No, we don't believe in this turtle narrative. That's a very specific thing that just had a happenstance out of colonization that their narrative is everywhere. Yeah, we don't have turtles.
Yeah.
What are you talking about? I'm from the Great Plains. You think there's water out there? We have rivers. We don't have lakes. And if you have a problem with that, email jreed@pawneynation.org and you just send all those that hate over there. Let Matt deal with that. And sure, Matt, he'll deal with it. But anyways, just for side tangent.
That's fine because it's sometimes I feel like people, and you probably deal with this, is that sometimes people will think of as Native American culture as this monolithic, ubiquitous thing. There's hundreds. I have a map behind me. That's one of the old Nat Geographic maps that you'd get. And the insert, that's all the language families. It's there's so many different kinds of cultures. Yeah. Or different cultures on just North America.
Does your map show the Lakotas out in the Great Plains?
I see the Pawnee in the Great Plains.
Well, as they should be.
Yeah. I don't see the Lakota.
Are they by the Great Lakes? Is that map right? Because there's 2 kinds of maps you'll find. You'll find language maps that are based on 19th century where people were, and then you'll find ones based on 16th century where people generally are placed before displacement of colonization. So I always go that route. Yeah,
it's difficult. I don't really when I put maps in my paper. It's I don't like any map I find because it's well, they all move. These are all mobile people, and they don't stay so Lake Huron's called Lake Huron because that's where when the French came and discovered it, that's where the Huron were living because they were displaced by the Iroquois. And they weren't from there. They moved there. They were refugees essentially.
Yeah,
I always go with the map that shows the Pawnee Nation having the largest territory possible. So that's my go-to. Is like, okay, where's the largest landmass map? That's the one that I'm throwing anywhere.
Not showing the Lakota later, which you kindly refer to as the invaders.
Oh yeah, the great Siouan invasion. Yeah. Yes. I like to remind people that Lakotas and Cheyennes and Arapahoes aren't from the plains originally. Like, I always have to throw that in somewhere. Like, they're not plains people. Yeah, they're from the Great Lakes. Get back across the Missouri River, please. That's where you belong. No, I shouldn't say that. We're going to get canceling.
What are you doing?
But no, I agree. It's like there's specific narratives for like turtle, the turtle. And it's like Mackinac Island is like the turtle island. And a lot of times people refer to all of North America as turtle islands. Like, well, I don't know if everyone believes that and all the different stories that are out there. Like the Hopi, they like, isn't like the ant people, and they came up from like below.
Yeah, you generally are going to find star people, and then
that's also an Anishinaabe culture, which is to get into like the creation story. The version I like to tell on my tour was that it was Nokomis, or you can call her Sky Woman as well. She fell through the hole in the sky to the back of the Great Turtle, and the hole in the sky is the Pleiades, which is pretty interesting. I always thought it is Pegeda-Gijik in Anishinaabe. That's also which in a ceremony called the Shaking Tent Ceremony, the Achisiakiwan, that tent that they use mimics the Pleiades, because they use, depends on, I've read some sources that say that it uses 7 poles, like there are 7 stars in the Pleiades, to mimic the Pegeda-Gijik as like this conduit for channeling the spirits into this tent.
See, now you're going to get me on another. No, this is actually not a rant. This is actually contributing archaeologically to this conversation in a meaningful way. So thanks for doing that. Yes, sorry. So the Pleiades is a major star assemblage, whatever you want to call that, cosmologic thing that the Pawnees gravitate towards. It's part of, we have stories about it, but like, I know it's also big at Cahokia. And there are Cahokian outposts just south of the Great Lakes. And so when I hear the Pleiades being like a major component, or someone being associated specifically with the Pleiades, like usually it's like 1 or 2 people, like these star people, but there seems to be this connection, I think, back to Cahokia with, because the Cahokia was a multicultural, multi-ethnic.
It was a metropolis.
Empire. It was like a state. I mean, hell, it had so much interactions with everywhere that I'm always curious, like the vestiges of Cahokia coming across in different societies across the Great Lakes, the Great Plains, and eastern woodlands, outside the Missouri River, Ohio River, Mississippi, like they had reach. I don't know. That's just when you were talking about the Pleiades and the Star Woman comes to me. I'm like, I bet my ass that there's a Cahokian connection, either directly or indirectly of that. But whatever. This isn't an academic podcast, so don't cite this.
It's all good. There's mounds in Grand Rapids, right along the Grand River.
There we go.
They're in Michigan. There's even some a bit further north in the central mitten. They're like kind of like henge, like not Stonehenge. It's not like mysterious Stonehenge found in Michigan. No, not one of those clickbaity like.
Yeah, right next to the articles. Viking tablets. Yes. It's all in one place.
So as I was talking earlier about like submerged archaeological sites, there's one that they found in Grand Traverse Bay, and it's in 40 feet of water, but it's also probably another caribou hunting structure. But there's also a huge rock that has a mastodon carved in it, and it's underwater. And that was actually on an episode of Ancient Aliens. And of course,
I bet it was.
Of course, they were trying to make it seem like the aliens did it. And I'm like, no, because they're trying to make it like connected with how sea level rise. And then obviously look at, sea level rise, there's all these like Atlantean states underwater. And look at this place in the Great Lakes. Aliens had something to do with it. It's like, no, man, like Lake Huron, Lake Michigan, when you're standing on the shoreline here, you're 580 feet above sea level. The ocean level does not affect the level of the lakes here.
Dude, all people need to do is just read introductory textbooks for like intro to geologic sciences, intro to archaeology. Like that dispels any of the BS that like Graham Hancock, who's now especially big with his Netflix documentary. He's on Netflix.
I'll probably watch it just to see.
So we're going to do a review episode of that. We're bringing Jesse Toon and Shane back on. We're all going to watch the first episode together and take notes and to do one of our little specials where we just
Mystery Science Theater 3000.
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah, man. Dude, well, this was a really fun conversation. I'm really glad we were able to get on the podcast, and this was just fascinating. And like you did, that was a really cool thesis. I hope you're able to get it in publication. And
that's the goal. That's the goal.
Sweet, man. And so, before we end the show, Josh, what are a couple sources, these books, articles, videos that you would recommend for anyone interested in ethno-geoarchaeology and like this whole concept?
That's the best way I could describe what my paper is, I guess. There's so many sources I would love to I can probably spend a whole other hour just talking about. There's this and this and this. Well, I mentioned it earlier. It's called Talking Rocks. The full title is Talking Rocks, Geology in 10,000 Years of Native American Tradition in the Lake Superior region. That's a mouthful. It's not an archaeology book at all. Like a conversation between a geologist and an Ojibwe elder. And it kind of it breaks the ice of that, these two different philosophical worlds can.
Is that a pun? Did you just put a geology pun in there on accident?
Probably.
I'm clapping either way.
Probably.
I can't tell if this was intentional breaking the ice. Anyway, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. I wanted all of us to acknowledge that this happened.
Doing a carriage tours, it's a lot of education, but it was a lot of entertainment as well, which means a lot of puns came in those tours. Another book I recommend is Ojibwe Heritage by Basil Johnston. That's a really good book into kind of delving into their cosmology and the ordering of their universe, which is, it's really great and I think essential to kind of understanding kind of my big idea. And then an archaeology paper, or rather anthropological paper, it's the prehistory of the Burnt Bluff area, which is about these rock art sites, Lake Michigan, where they believe that shamans canoed up to these caves and shot arrows at the rock art. And they're able, the entire artifact assemblage in those caves is 83% projectile points that were not refinished, that all have shattered tips. And there's no habitation in these sites. And it's just purely a sacred site. And that kind of that's one of my favorite. That's one of the things that actually got me into anthropology is I went to that cave when I was a senior in high school.
Hell yeah.
It sounds like that's just the tip of the iceberg with literature recommendations, though.
Oh, yeah. Sorry.
Here we go again. Now the floodgates have been unleashed with all the goddamn Ice Age puns.
All right.
We warned Josh about the shit show that is recording with us.
Oh, don't worry about it,
downhill
guys.
so quickly.
So where can our listeners find you on social media or email or get in contact with you?
So you can find me on Instagram at JM Wolford. So it's my first initial, middle initial, last name. Pretty simple. Then if you want to email me, you can email me at jmwolford51@gmail.com. If you have any questions, I can send you my thesis. I can, answer questions about, more things, have conversation about it.
Yeah. Awesome. I'm also my last name, my first and last name with a number, because apparently I'm not the first C. John in 23 in the world. So because this is a life in ruins, we have to ask you a very important question. So if you could do it all over again, would you still choose to be an ethno-geoarchaeologist?
Yes. I don't know if I'd call myself an ethno-geoarchaeologist, but I definitely am an anthropologist who studies ethno-geoarchaeology.
Hell yeah, man. Well, we just interviewed Josh Wolford. You can find him on Instagram at jmwolford and send him an email at jmwolford51@gmail.com. Per usual, Connor.
Rate, review the podcast, please. We actually got a ton. We got a ton of them. We got 8 more reviews since the last time. So thank you so much. Keep doing that. That's how we get out into the world. So thank you. If you have any problems with this episode, email Carlton. Any hate messages from his slander. If you have any biology, any problems with my biology hate, send it to me. We love interacting with you. Yeah. Thank you all so much.
And if you are listening to this show on the All Shows feed, please subscribe to our individual show, A Life in Ruins podcast. Having you guys download our show directly from our show, not the All Shows feed, allows us to get, basically we can actually see who's listening to our podcast, which allows us to get advertisers and sponsors for the show that help us run the show and produce additional content. The All Shows feed is considered its own different show, and we can't get metrics for that. So we have a base. We know more people are listening and following our show, but we can't see that because we can't see those numbers. So All Shows feed, fantastic place to see all the different shows on the APN and get a variety. But if you like our show, please subscribe to Life in Ruins.
And with that, we are out.
Thanks for listening to A Life in Ruins podcast.
You can follow us on Instagram and Facebook at A Life in Ruins Podcast, and you can also email us at alifeinruinspodcast@gmail.com.
And remember, make sure to bring your archaeologists in from the cold and feed them beer.
And if you've made it past the credits, you know it is our favorite time of the episode for Connor's witty joke. Connor, what do you have for me and Josh today?
It's a doozy. So I heard this story on the internet. So this guy finds himself as a cook on a ship that just has set off. He does a quick survey of the kitchen. Everything seems right in the right places, but he finds several bags of potatoes that are all shaped like penises. He's like, that's weird. And he goes and asks the captain. He's like, hey, what's with all the potatoes looking like penises? I don't like it. Can we change that? And the captain says, well, you can't change it. This is a dictatorship.
Oh, Jesus. God damn it, Connor.
That's a good one. Okay. Taters.
Oh.
Taters precious.
Potatoes.
Oh. Boil and mash them, stick them in a stew. Oh, God. Well, it's almost Thanksgiving, so we're about to be doing a lot of that. So,
yes,
all right, everyone. And with Josh, once again, thank you so much for being on the show. And with that, we are truly
Thanks for having me, guys.
This episode was produced by Chris Webster from his RV traveling the United States, Tristan Boyle in Scotland, DigTech LLC, Culturo Media, and the Archaeology Podcast Network, and was edited by Chris Webster.
This has been a presentation of the Archaeology Podcast Network. Visit us on the web for show notes and other podcasts at www.archpodnet.com. Contact us at chris@archaeologypodcastnetwork.com.